Thank you very much for coming to this event. The Centre for Ageing Better is welcoming you, and I welcome you too. And I'm glad you all sent a message to me to be in Clerkenwell at 9 a.m, because I just made it. My name is Paul Lewis. I'm a freelance financial journalist, and some of you may know me from Moneybox on Radio 4. Somebody I introduced myself to earlier said, "Oh, nice to put a face to a voice," and you could just see her thinking, "But not that face." That's the joy of being on radio. Now, today we're focused on planning and preparing for later lives, and amazing figures that by 2026, which sounds way in the future, but actually isn't that long, is it? There'll be over 14 million people aged 65 or more, and I hope I'm still around to be among them. And that's nearly a 20% increase in 10 years. So planning for that time of life, so there will be far more old people and far more planning to be done for them. And it's how we sort of embrace those extra years and plan and prepare for our later lives. And that's what I want you to talk about today. We're going to have presentations and then lots of questions, I hope, from the audience. And I was thinking about this when I read Claire Preston's interesting report, that we all have a bit of cognitive dissonance, as we used to call it, believing two different things at the same time, which, just listen to a politician if you really want to know what that means. We all know we'll die, but we don't spend all our lives worrying about it. And similarly, we all know, the great majority of us know, that we'll get old. But when are you old? There's no date now, even no official date, because pension age is changing. 2, I think, or maybe more million people work after what used to be pension age. And so we're putting off when we will retire, and we're easing into it rather than it coming as a big bang. And I don't know if any of you, or some of you here, will remember Harold Macmillan, who was asked what's the most difficult thing about being Prime Minister, and he said, events, dear boy, events. And it is those events, because however you plan, your health might go, your relationship might end, your job might be lost if you're working, and of course for many women, state pension age, which they were expecting to be 60, has been put off for some of them to 67. It leaves a rather blank time in their planning. So planning is difficult when you've got these complete unknowns. It's how we plan for the unpredictable and how we build resilience into our lives that will take us through whatever the world throws to us. So we're marking the launch of Ageing Better's new research, which is conducted by Anglia Ruskin University. Claire Preston is here, and she'll be talking to us about that in a moment, and there'll be copies of it for you later. And I want all the time people are speaking, I want you to be, obviously not ignoring them, but thinking hard to yourselves what you'd like to ask, what you can contribute to this debate about what individuals can do. And I'm really glad to see there's a huge age range here. There's people maybe sort of my age almost, and right down to people perhaps a third of my age, which is one of the things you get when you start getting older. So thoughts, personal reflections, planning, perhaps what you've done yourself. And of course some of you have been writing those thoughts on the window over there, which is very interesting. Now the debate is being streamed through this camera here on Ageing Better's YouTube channel, and I suppose the central question really is, what are your hopes for a later life, and what can you do now to help achieve them, and of course how we can help society to do that. There is, I'm told, no fire drill planned, so if the alarm goes off, you're like an air steward now, that is the way out through there. It says toilets, but actually there is an exit just beyond that. And so what I'm going to start with is introducing Claire Preston, who's going to present her research, and then we've got this illustrious panel here, but I'll give you their names a bit later, because keeping all that in your head at the same time is difficult for me anyway, it may not be for you. So I'm going to introduce Claire Preston from Anglia Ruskin University, where she's a research fellow, and she's going to talk to us for a few minutes about the research and what she's done. Claire.
Hello everybody, good to see you all here. Of course it isn't just me who did this work. As you can see, I was part of a team of colleagues, so I'm taking the credit today, but it wasn't all my own work. Okay, so planning preparing for later life. what do we mean by planning? We've got a definition here, and the point really is that it's deliberate and future oriented. So something you just happen to be doing that's good for later life doesn't count as planning. This has to be deliberate and future oriented. How do we know that planning's happening? This is a tricky one. There are various ways that you might know planning's happening. There's the obvious ones, which result planning that's resulted in a kind of concrete action. So that's taking out a pension, taking out a will. We know that planning's happened under those circumstances. But what if your plan is to not move house? There's not going to be any particular evidence that you've planned. The other one, what about reactive planning? What about you've planned to stay in work because you don't have any choice, you can't leave? So sometimes the degree of choice you have acts as a proxy for planning. So that's another way that we kind of know it's happening, but it might be difficult to capture. There's two ways that researchers who are looking into planning tend to kind of gather their evidence of planning. One is they go out and ask people, are you planning? And the other is they look for, how many people have got pensions and so on. And how much planning is happening. I'll give you an example of both of those. So one survey asked people what their aspirations for later life were, and about 50% of people in their 50s, which is me, said they hadn't thought at all, or hadn't thought much about their later life. Now the question is, of course, with things like those surveys, is how reliable is that? Is that the right question, and so on. But we also know from more, if you like, concrete evidence that people aren't planning as much, perhaps, as they should. So in 2013, it was said in a report that 12 million people were heading towards retirement with inadequate incomes. And I'll have to read this one out, I can't keep this one in my head. We also know that around 60% of 45 to 54-year-olds don't have a will. So those are just a couple of examples of the absence of planning. Okay, what we did, this was a literature review. So what we do is we look at all of the reports and so on that are out there and try to summarise the findings. What I'm doing now is I'm going to spend 10 minutes, a very swift 10 minutes, trying to sum up a 100-page report in which we synthesised evidence from these 116 papers. So we took the papers and we categorised what they said according to the research questions, which were who plans, what are the barriers and enablers, and how might we help people to overcome them. What was the weight of evidence, if you like? The financial literature really dominates the scene. There's an awful lot of literature about pensions for obvious reasons. And there's a lot less about other things which we know are important to people, and which actually is, I had a read of these, that people want health, happiness, things like this. There's far less research done about planning in those areas, although we know that they're important to people. And the focus is very much on planning as an individual pursuit. Now this is you can see this is at its worst as an example of placing responsibility on the individual for their later lives. But it's also, and sometimes it's just neglect. People aren't thinking of people in their social networks. They're tending to think of them as these kind of isolated individuals planning on their own. And the other thing is research is framed in different ways, depending on the researcher's view or the organisation's view of what explains behaviour. So some people might approach the whole issue thinking that it's all about personality that you're born with. Other people might say, no, that's not what explains behaviour, it's attitudes that you learn as a result of your experiences in life. Other people might say, no, none of that matters, what it's really about are basic things like the context of your life, how much money have you got. So the reports will have different explanations, if you like, of the same phenomenon, depending on where they're coming from. Who doesn't plan and why? This was obviously the main point of interest. And there are a range of, actually I think I'll start by reading out these two quotes because that sort of illustrates it more in a way. So these are two kind of example quotes of non-planners, if you like. So basically I take my life, I wouldn't say day to day, but certainly week to week. I just don't think about the future too much because I've found it doesn't pay. I know it sounds wicked, but what's the point worrying about after 65 if I'm not sure I'll even get there with all my health problems? So those are two kind of examples of non-planners. And behind these, there's a cluster of demographic features, and unfortunately they're the usual suspects. So they're low income, living in rented housing, poor health, low education. These are the factors which people who plan less tend to have. And then there's a host of attitudes accompanying that. And one of the key barriers to planning is this kind of fatalism. So people know there's an issue, but they think it's beyond their capacity to do anything about it. And that is a key barrier. So, sorry. Ooh. Enablers, right. Okay, that's lucky. I thought we had a technical problem. Okay, so we looked at the enablers and the barriers to planning, and what we've got here on the left, we've got 5 categories that we put them in, 5 umbrella categories, and then on the right are the subcategories. So on the enablers, we have essentially there's this idea of awareness or salience. You've got to kind of have a plan in mind if you're going to plan. And it might be something you want to achieve, or it might be something you want to avoid, but that you need to have a plan in mind. Then the next thing is you need to feel it's all very well having a goal, but how able are you to achieve the goal? So that comes down to, are you a person who has had a lifetime of feeling that your future is in your own, in your control or not? Planners tend to be those kind of people. I can determine my own future. And again, the resources question. Have you actually got sufficient resources to plan? Okay. So here are 3 more umbrella categories on the left. The knowledge and skills. This particularly pertains to financial planning. Do you even understand what a pension is, or how much money is actually going into your pension? Instrumental and informational support. So there's quite a lot of research showing that employers aren't actually offering people flexible work. So a lot of people might want to continue working in later life, think, well, it'd be fine if I can work part-time, but they haven't got an employer who supports them. And some people obviously have much more understanding employers. And the social influence as well. Do your friends plan? Are you in a group of people who plans? So one of the reports found that people who work in an office with lots of older people tend to plan more. Futures there in front of them. So, okay, so the barriers. Same set of categories on the left, but different subcategories on the right. So this is the reverse, if you like. The issue seems a long way off. You say, oh, people in my family, we don't have heart problems in my family. I don't need to take any particular measures. Then there's the experience of life is unpredictable. I've never been, as we saw, that person I've found it doesn't pay to plan. And again, the key one, I just don't have any money. That's why I'm not saving for a pension. Okay, and then the knowledge and skills, as I've said, this is about, particularly, you find this in the research about finance, people don't understand the products. There's also a thing about how familiar are they with those products. If you haven't had savings in your life, you're not going to be awfully familiar with savings products when you get to be old, and this gets to be more of an issue. The instrumental and informational support, there's particularly infrastructure issues when it comes to housing. So a lot of people would like to move house, but they can't find a house that's suitable in the area where they live. So there's an issue with care homes. People think, well, I ought to go into care, but actually I really don't find, particularly these are people from LGBT groups, they're worried about how they're going to be treated in a care home. So the whole prospect of having to kind of think about it becomes very unpleasant. And the social influences that undermine planning. The gendered, one of these is the gendered role beliefs. So women who've spent their lives being accommodating may find that one of the reports said that women won't ask if they can have flexible, if they can have a part-time job because they don't want to rock the boat at work. So there's things like this that will get in the way of people planning. The negative perceptions and terminologies, again, particularly relates to housing. So where the housing that you might move into is called sheltered housing, it seems a less attractive proposition. what can be done about it? Okay, key question. And we've divided this into the structural level and individual level. The structural level, this is the more conducive environment, more support from your employers. There was a report that showed, a big report that showed that a lot of employers now, for fear of being seen as ageist, don't want to raise the issue with their employees about what their plans for retirement are. And again, this issue about recognising the different levels of capacity to plan. The rollback of the welfare state, this individualising of responsibility for later life. And actually, surely it's the responsibility of local, not just ourselves, it's the responsibility of local government, civil society, all of the charitable sector and so on. So this kind of structural support for planning is very important. At the individual level, there are some sort of formal planning programs, but the evidence around those doesn't tend to be great, so it's not really clear. Some of the ones that seem to work better are the ones that combine actions now with thinking about the future. Those seem to be slightly more promising, so it's not all about the future, it's about what you can do now as well. So keep fit now, and by the way, have you got a pension? Preserve the good things in life. This is about getting people to recognise what it is about their lives that are good. For example, you're living in a place where there's a bus stop, there's some shops within walking distance, you've got a bunch of friends around. Probably not a great idea to move house and go and live out in the country where you don't know anybody, although that's a very common aspiration of people. Time perspectives, this is a nice one. There was a report that showed if you showed people their pictures of themselves morphed to look older, then they started thinking about planning, which is great. Avoid a sense of obligation. So an example here, women who go to exercise classes tend to stick with them longer if they enjoy them now than if they're going because they have a sort of sense of obligation. I really ought to be going along to this class. And then there's the better inform. I've probably run over my time, so I'll just leave you with a few final thoughts.
Claire, thank you very much. Right, so we can have some questions just Claire briefly from the floor before I introduce the panel, if that's okay. So a number of interesting things there. I thought half the 50-year-old hadn't planned. I thought it was very interesting. And how to get people to engage. So thoughts on that, just a couple of questions to Claire and then we'll introduce the panel. So, yes, the lady here. Could you wait for the microphone because we are... we can, well, we just got to be on the stream.
It's more a comment about it because I've worked with people with terminal illness and older people. I think what is not brought in all this is about change of cultural behavior. I was brought up living in this country and the country where people rented a place and private insurance from little on, always put something away for old age. When I look here, and I was a younger generation who wanted now, and I don't care what is the future. I can see the problem is rising. However, we try to bring up the under 50 or under 60, I'm 70 now, to say, think about it, say, wrong, because we live in a different world. I want it now, I want to go on holiday, I need to car, and if you say something, what about when we get older? Oh, I don't want to know. And I think this we have to address the culture of teaching people it is important to make some sort of plan, and maybe it's important as well to save a little bit. So yes, I have a little bit of a problem expecting people to do something and back in their mind they don't really have it.
Yeah, I mean, I leave that really to somebody young to respond to, but I have two younger daughters. And I think that in their 20s, and I think that the situation now with many young people is that they're living very precarious lives, and actually having any extra money to save is kind of beyond their expectations and wildest dreams. The other thing I would also say is that the world is a very uncertain place at the moment, and uncertainty stops people planning as well. They feel frozen. What shall I do? Yeah.
Okay, other questions.
I was very interested, I'm from Southwark on Interaction Alliance, and we have a member from Southwark Pension Centre, and this is the centre where there's lots of activities going on for local older people, just 50 plus actually, and one of their regular members unfortunately passed away earlier in the year, and they got together and left with, you know, a lot of mess with no will and so on, and they all got together and decided that they needed to do something about this, and they've set up an event called Be Prepared that's happening next month. And it's free, it's going to be open to everybody, and they are going to talk about things like will planning, health and social care, housing, and lasting power of attorney. So it's interesting that you'll find it's about, you know, group planning and the need to do it as a group and to sort of support each other with this, and that's actually kind of what's happening. And but it's an interesting one that's coming out of a centre of people who do lots of group activities together already. And so I'm just thinking about ways we can sort of try and tap into various groups around the country that do things together already and have that kind of mutual trust to then have events like this one and to sort of get people thinking.
I think that sounds great. It sounds really interesting and kind of positive step. Yeah, and I think that people often feel disempowered to plan on their own, but with a group they may think, well, here we, actually we kind of do this together. This all becomes more possible. I think the age-friendly cities is quite an interesting one. It doesn't kind of come into the planning literature, but actually, that is about planning. And groups of people will. There are lots of examples. Centre for Aging Better's done some research in this area. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's very helpful to think of yourself as part of a group rather than kind of struggle on your own.
Because also, if in that group you'll have somebody who's got a background in financial stuff, who can help each other with pension stuff. Somebody who's got more health background who can advise each other on, forms of exercise or nutrition, whatever.
Yeah.
So they can help support each other.
Yes.
Think with these very complicated issues sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps one more for Claire, and then we'll move on to the panel. The gentleman here. Would you wait for the microphone?
Thank you. As you can probably see, I've reached that age. I just want to say, in response to the lady who just spoke, one of the things I'm eternally grateful for is the fact that I actually live in Surrey. It seems to be the only local authority in the whole of the UK that has this idea of free swim and gym. And that's helped me enormously to at least stay fairly active and reach the age of 80 without falling apart. So I think the point I really want to make is there seems to be a lack of real planning by government. I mean, it's pop luck. It's a postcode lottery. As I said, I'm eternally grateful that I am in Southwark. I'm certainly going to that meeting that's been talked about. But why can't the government do more? I mean, you seem to put obstacles in your way. At my age, I ought to be downsizing. I live in one of these large houses because that's what I bought many years ago. I tried to do it, and all I got was obstacles. There's all this talk, oldie people should, free up the space that they have. Yeah, I'd love to. But you try and do it.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of research that says exactly that. You're not alone in that experience. There's a lot of research about downsizing, which says exactly that. People would be quite happy to downsize if the infrastructure was there. And another issue, I think, similar to your swim and gym, you said, didn't you, is the libraries, closing of libraries. I mean, if people are planning to kind of stay connected with their communities and so on, these are important facilities out there and services which are being taken away, unfortunately. So yeah, I agree.
Okay, that's three useful comments. Very useful comments and interesting ideas, I think, all about community, really. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Claire. Claire will be here to pop up from time to time, I'm sure, when things arise. But let me now introduce the panel who are going to give their thoughts. They all have some experience in this area. And I'm going to just take them in order along the row, which is the easiest way to do it. Matthew Blackstad is head of the Insight Unit at NEST, which is the kind of official auto-enrolment pension organisation. He describes the Insight Unit as a think tank and says, don't worry, it gets paid for separately, not by our pensioners. So, Matthew, your thoughts?
Thank you, Paul. First of all, I'd just like to say how much I welcome this report from the Centre for Ageing Better, and particularly not just because of the quality of the work that Claire's team have done, but also because it's the first example I know of that's made a real effort to bring together the evidence across all these different areas. And as I hope I can bring out as I speak now, I think it's really striking how much of a shared challenge this is. Planning for the future is not something that's specific to my sector, the pension sector, and I think we'll benefit greatly if we're much more joined up between our different areas of work than we've been in the past. But having said that, I am going to talk about pensions, so sorry about that. But hopefully, as Claire has pointed out, there is a considerably greater body of evidence in the area of planning financially for the future, for which I apologise. No one wants more literature about pensions, but there is an awful lot of it out there. But hopefully, the fact that we have done quite a lot of work in encouraging participation in pensions is something that does bring some lessons for other areas of planning. And I just want to bring out a few points that have come from our experience, particularly from the auto-enrolment reforms that have gone on recently in the UK. So the first thing to say, and I think this comes out really strongly in the report, is it's no accident that we tend to be biased towards the short term, that we're short-term animals, if you like. And this definitely isn't just a pensions issue. I want to be slimmer next week, but the hamburger is delicious today. And our natural inclination to do things that give us short-term pleasure, they're not just specific to the young, by the way. We actually see this as well from people even just a few years from retirement. It can be quite hard to prioritise your needs when you're 80, even when you're 65. This is something that we don't overcome easily. And so I think one of the things, and Claire touched on this, one of the things that feels really effective is where you can encourage an intervention today that gives me something back today as well as paying off in the future. It's a win-win. I'm rewarding my present self as well as my future self. And those rewards can be soft. They can just be the peace of mind of knowing that you're doing something, but nonetheless they can be really important. And a number of the strategies that we've tried in the pension sector, again brought out in the report, I think are very effective. But one I just bring out, which was on Claire's sort of short list, is the idea of preserving the good things in life. So this is really just a sort of a very simple message, really, rather than a direct impact. But just talking to people about the things they enjoy doing today, be it a sport or going out with friends or going to the movies, and trying to encourage them to think about having enough income for later life. It is in a way a much more direct way of doing things, rather than sort of showing people their faces morphed to show their old, but it has a very similar effect. The second thing I'd say, though, and I think this is where the big challenge maybe comes in, is that the solution that we found in pensions to overcoming people's short-termism is to do the thing for them. So the way automatic enrolment works is you don't opt into a pension, you're opted into it by your employer, and you can still choose to opt out. But because the default has changed, we've flipped from a situation where maybe only a tenth of people would participate in a workplace plan to one where 90% of people plan. And this is one of the sort of biggest sort of impacts you can possibly get from what is, relatively speaking, a simple change. And that's great, and it's been incredibly effective. We've now got nearly 10 million people in this country who are saving in a pension who wouldn't be if that hadn't happened. But it brings its own challenges. We're bringing everyone in on a default. We're not supporting their own needs. Many people's awareness that even that they're in a pension is incredibly low. So the question that arises is, if there are, as the slide just said, if there are alternatives to planning, which is just about doing things for people, that's great. But how can you then take that default of bringing people in automatically and turn that into something which gets people to plan actively? And actually, we think there are some strong indicators that this might happen in our system. Of the 7 million people roughly who are saving in NEST, 250,000 of them weren't eligible to be auto-enrolled, but they enrolled themselves. So just by setting up a system that does do things automatically, maybe we can build on that because people are participating, because they're building savings. Can we use that as a vehicle to encourage them to do more planning? And then the final point I'd like to make, which again is probably one of the strongest points in the report, is it really matters who you are. This is not a one-size-fits-all thing. And I think that one of the things that comes through really strongly across all the areas of planning is how much low income has an effect on the extent to which you proactively plan. And I'm a strong kind of, I make a lot of noise about this because I think we tend to blame people on lower incomes for not making good choices. Actually, low-income people are the best planners you will ever meet. It's just that the load they have in terms of the number of decisions they have to make on an hourly basis and the cognitive load that creates makes it so much harder to intervene. And this again is one of the really big reasons why simplifying things, joining up between different areas of planning, joining the services up is really, really important, because the simpler you make things, the more likely it is people are going to be able to take those decisions on in the context of their daily lives. And final point on it matters who you are is just one thing I'd like to sort of bring out from a piece of work we recently did, where we did a statistical analysis of the 7 million people saving in theirs, and trying to work out sort of who they were and what their behaviour was. And although a lot of people at the moment aren't doing very much because automatic enrolment's only just started, one of the things that really came out to me was that we talk a lot about women saving less for retirement, and that's true. In Nest as in other places, but actually if you control for their income, if you compare women on a given income with men on a given income, women are doing more. So I think one of the things I'd want to bring out from that is that it is often people's circumstances that is the thing that maybe makes them look like they're not planning and they're not preparing, but sometimes if you dig under the skin and if you give people opportunities to take active decisions and participate, they actually do so. So hopefully that's a useful set of learnings from the pensions area.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed. Claire Turner next. She is with the Centre for Ageing Better, where she is, it's a marvellous title this, Claire, Director of Evidence, so and a very evidence-based report as well. So Claire.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, great job, Frank, isn't it? So I mean, I echo what Matthew says. It's great to have this review and to launch it today, and I think I suppose echoing the kind of stat that Claire said in her presentation, I saw a finding from some NatSen research the other day that was talking about 60% of people haven't really thought about their hopes and ambitions for life after 60, either much or at all. And I thought, well, that's kind of sounds pretty reasonable for people in their 20s and their 30s, beyond saving into a pension. That's understandable, but what about this group that we're very interested in, about those approaching later life, those from midlife onwards? And this life stage is the focus of the review today, but it's also the focus of our work at the Centre for Ageing Better. And our hypothesis is that this is a kind of period of life which is close enough to later life for these issues to be salient, but also with enough time to do something to change the future. And I suppose what we're asking at the Centre for Ageing Better is, well, what is it possible to plan and prepare for at this life stage in order to have a better later life? And I suppose the 3 points that I wanted to raise, I suppose, in response to the review today. One is, and I think echoing kind of Matthew's final point, was about context is key. We know the capacity of individuals to plan is, hugely influenced by the social, economic, political context in which they live. And that life events and life experiences really do matter. The evidence, the research about people experiencing poverty, and the kind of level of bandwidth they have to think beyond immediate concerns and pressures is very real. And we can't talk about individuals need to plan for social care without locating that debate in the context about an underfunded system. And we know that people approaching later life in this life phase, are facing many immediate pressures, lots of competing demands on their time, whether that's juggling work and caring responsibilities, little time to look after their health and well-being. And that's for your average person, who's kind of, I suppose, these time and resource pressures make future-oriented thinking very difficult. And once you add other challenges on top of that, for those who are most at risk of missing out on a good later life, it's not difficult to see how hard this is. So I feel really important in the debates that we have to locate these individual behaviours in the context of people's lives. But I don't think that means that we should say that some people are unable to plan for a better future. And I suppose my second point would be about looking beyond financial planning. Much of the available evidence, as Claire said, is focused on financial planning, which is great. But how do we get people to think about, to talk about, to act on the other, the messy stuff? Where do you want to live? How are you going to maintain your friends and relationships? What is a good death? So I think, is the main barrier to thinking about these things a kind of fear of old age, a fear of death? And do we need to think, I suppose, about a sort of campaign that's about, we need to talk about ageing. So again, I suppose the point that you made about the kind of culture shift that we need in society. And I think there are some interesting developments that are about trying to support people to think about planning in more of a holistic way. So we've got the kind of idea of a midlife MOT that's come through a kind of Cridland report and that's of interest to the Department for Work and Pensions, which is trying to combine support for people to think about their finances, their work and their health. There's also kind of courses and initiatives that are provided by big employers, and at Centre for Ageing Better we're working with a Baking Foundation to kind of think about these types of kind of courses that you could offer to people in midlife that really have, I suppose, at the heart of their, this kind of really powerful question, which is, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? And finally, I think building on kind of Matthew's point, you know, are we, in some cases, are we saying, actually, don't plan, just do it? You know, and actually, you know, is there an argument that in some areas we should just bypass planning activity altogether? And rather than kind of putting more money in education, in information, in awareness raising, you know, in some cases, should we just invest money on getting people over the line and just do things? So, you know, is there a sort of auto-enrollment equivalent for wills, for example? You know, could you say you can't get a mortgage unless you've got a will? You know, or Matt Hancock's idea, you know, this week about can you take auto-enrollment for social care? You know, this idea of actually just being able to kind of get people to opt people into something so that we can just get them to do it. So I'd be really interested, I think, in sort of debating those kind of ideas today. And I suppose my very final point would be that we know that life is unpredictable and it's uncertain, and it's arguably more so for future generations and that those at risk of missing a good later life. So I suppose in this context, do people think that, you know, things like adaptability and resilience are much more useful kind of skills and characteristics than the ability to plan?
Okay. So I'll use this one. Thanks very much indeed. And now Alison Whistler, who is Alison Whisker, who's with Citizens Advice and has been doing some work in this field. She can tell me about. So, Alison.
Thank you. I can really relate to the findings from the research. We've just carried out a piece of research ourselves called Looking Forward, which we're going to publish tomorrow. But that looked at 50 and 60-year-olds and looked at their attitudes to later life and preparing for later life. But it was quite different in that we worked with 30 people, but in a really in-depth way. So we spent some time with them, looking at their lives and looking at what was important to them. And what we found basically mirrored a lot of the research that Aging Better have brought forward in their research. But our overwhelming finding was that people didn't want to think about getting older. They couldn't see themselves and didn't want to see themselves as being frail or needing care, and they didn't want to think about their own mortality. And so actually there was a block there that meant they really weren't prepared to plan about that or even think about that. And the other thing was that they really wanted to live life now, and almost every one of them said, you never know what's around the corner. I'm going to enjoy myself now because you just don't know. But we also found similar things in that, you know, the overwhelming thing for a lot of people was that they didn't have money to put aside for later life. A lot of them were in their 50s and 60s, but still on the minimum wage, and had only enough money to live on and pay their rent and pay their food and have little treats for things like taking their grandchildren out. So we've, as Paul said, we've been thinking about this area for quite a while now. And a few sort of thoughts from us in terms of what might help in the future in terms of preparing people for later life. We think that if we can help people plan now and throughout life, then actually it becomes kind of a habit. So people had no problems when we talked to them about planning things that were shorter term. So if you said to them, how do you feel about planning about, you know, moving house or planning for Christmas or planning for a holiday, can you do that? Are you good at planning? And they all said, oh yeah, we can do that. And we can plan, you know, how we spend our money because we don't have that much. So that planning wasn't the issue, it was the kind of the long-term aspects of that were a problem for them. And I think linking planning to life changes and life events is really, really important. So actually when we see people who maybe are going through something like they've lost a job and that's affected what their life is like, or they're facing bereavement, or maybe they're having their first child and need to look at the finances because that's not working out. They get relief from doing the planning and dealing with those issues. And actually, if we can capture people at those stages and encourage them to always get help and to plan for what happens next, then actually that builds resilience. and actually it makes it easier as you get older to deal with things as they crop up, and we think that's really important. One of the other things that's already been mentioned a couple of times is that we really believe that organisations and services need to work together, because no one organisation can provide all the support and the information, the help that people need to be prepared, but actually when you get to later life to deal with any issues that come up. So at Citizens Advice we can help with practical things, we can help with debt and benefits and housing, we can help with information advice about your pensions, but actually we can't give you health advice. We can't tell you, where best to shop. We can't. We don't provide group activities. We don't provide those kind of social interactions. But we know organisations locally that do. And by referring people from one service to another, then hopefully people will feel much more prepared and much more able to deal with issues as they crop up. And the other thing is that there have been a couple of calls for kind of national level support to help people prepare for later life. And all I would say is that any national approach that we do get has to be appropriate to local communities and local people's needs. So there's no point in having something that looks good on paper but actually doesn't work for people back in their own local area.
Thank you very much indeed. And now James Walsh, who is with the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association, used to be the National Association of Pension Funds, that's how I always think of it, sort of describes what you do, doesn't it? And James is the policy lead for engagement and the EU. He's promised not to talk about Brexit. We could all do at least 2 hours without that. James.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Yeah, Brexit-free zone for a few minutes anyway. Very good to be here. I very much agree with what Matthew was saying about the tension we've got in the world of pensions at the moment. You know, on the one hand we have auto-enrolment, which has been fantastically successful, bringing 10 million new people into pension saving, fantastic, and that is of course all about trading on people's inertia, on just defaulting them without them necessarily knowing it's even happening to them into saving for a pension. And yet when people get towards a point of retirement, with the George Osborne pension freedom reforms, of course, then we expect people at that point to be tremendously proactive and personally responsible and take really complex decisions for themselves about how they're going to use what pension saving they've got in retirement. So it's quite a disjunction there in the whole pension system that we've got. And I noticed part of Matthew's answer to that was to say we need to give people opportunities to plan, I think is how you put it, Matthew. I think that's exactly right. And a couple of ideas we have at the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association about how to do that. One would be the midlife financial health checks. It's really, I suppose, what Alison was alluding to. It's something that our friends at Age UK have looked into as well. And I think that if you could deliver some sort of health check, financial health check for people at 45 or around there, at a moment when they've still got plenty of time before they're going to retire, still got time to adjust their finances, and talk them through what are you doing about a pension? Perhaps what are you doing about your job? Should you be thinking about retraining so you can continue working for many years to come? You know, what are your family circumstances? I think a health check like that to get people focused and get them thinking about planning would be a step forward. Now, that is a big program and someone has to deliver it. Would be a job we could give to Alison and her friends at Citizens Advice, although she looked a little nervous when I put that to her earlier. Perhaps a better choice would be the new single financial guidance body that's coming along in the next few months, merging Pensions Advice Service and Pension Rise and the Money Advice Service. I think that probably would be the right bit, but I see that health check as a key way of helping people to think, yes, I need to plan. The other thing is, to help them specifically with planning about pensions, many people say, when we get talking to them, they say, well, I don't know how much I'm supposed to be saving. You pensions guys are telling me I should be saving for a pension, but how much? I have no idea. So wouldn't it be helpful if we gave people some kind of clear targets to aim towards? And we think that we should pick up an idea that has been used quite successfully in Australia, where they have what we would call retirement income targets, where you show people 3 levels of retirement lifestyle. A pretty basic one, a sort of medium one, a modest one, and a rather more comfortable and prosperous one. And you say to people, if you're on the basic level, then you won't be able to run a car, you'll be on public transport. If you're on the middle one, then maybe you can have a second-hand car, and if you're on the prosperous one, you can afford a nice new shiny motor. And you can talk about it in the same way in terms of what kind of holidays you might be able to afford in later life, whether you could afford good home repairs. Even the Australians talk about whether you can afford a nice bottle of wine on the comfortable level or home brew only on the basic level. When you talk to people in that way about what kind of lifestyle do you want to be able to afford in retirement, then you've got them engaged, and you can talk to them then about how much you need to be saving in order to afford that lifestyle, and give them a target for their pension saving to aim at. So that's something that we've been talking about a lot over the last few months, and we'll continue talking about, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, James. That's very interesting, because one of the things Matthew was talking about was how little people save through auto-enrolment, and how little people save through auto-enrolment. And you're saying, obviously, they should save a lot more, and it's bridging that gap, which is one of the problems that we face. So thank you all very much indeed for that, stimulating ideas, and all of them a bit different, but with some commonalities. So, points from the floor now, and it's your turn to debate. We've got more than half an hour to do this, and there's a lady here, and a gentleman there, a lady there. So let's start with the gentleman there, and then we come to you next, imagine. I'll turn my microphone off.
Thank you. One of the points I particularly noted on Claire's slides was about positive over age. I can't remember the exact phrase. People, sorry?
Stereotypes.
Thank you. Positive age, higher age stereotypes. That's got to be one of the most important things, because people will still remember what they've seen on TV, on film, what they've read about in books. They may have seen even around them in the village. People who, when they got to 55, 60, they were frail, don't want that. But nowadays, 70 must be like the new 45, maybe 50. But it's not 70 as we used to know it. So that is something that must be emphasised. And I don't see anybody actually doing that. On the other hand, we do have the increasing problem of dementia. A lot of noise is made about that, some useful noise, but this is one of the things, frankly, that scares me. Secondly, on pensions, yes, Nest, I don't want to diss Nest or the capacities, but just because the auto-enrolment rate has gone up towards 90% is actually very misleading, because the amounts going in are not going to produce anything worth having. It is not a pension plan. It is an individual savings plan with a little bit of tax relief. Turning to James' point about telling people how much they might need to save. Let's remember, back in 2006, Inland Revenue changed the tax reliefs available, maybe jogging about up and down. If you really want a good lifestyle, you're probably going to be over the current lifetime limit. And so you're telling people, yeah, you need to put in 25% because you can't afford. You'll get tax relief on some of it, depending upon how much you're paid. And when you get to retirement, whatever you do with the fund, whether you go for a drawdown, whether you opt to take it somewhere else, or whether you just take an annuity, you might find yourself caned again by the government at the time because you've got too much money in your pension pot. There used to be a very good pension system, final salary pension schemes operated by employers who were too scared to continue operating them. It's really sad. If we get the CDC schemes back, or in, that could be a problem, and I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you very much. On to money very rapidly there. Apart from dementia at 70, the new 50. I try and do my bit to show people what you can do at an older age, but you know, there we go. How many people see me? The lady at the front, and then we'll take some answers. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at once. Lady at the front.
Thank you very much. I want to start with what the lady from Southwark was saying about the value of people planning in groups. I think that's an excellent initiative. But I think there's other things as well which are helpful, because groups aren't for everybody, and I think sort of how-to guides you know, I'm one of these people, if I want to know something, I go and get a book on it. I've borrowed out of the library The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning. I haven't read it yet because of the sort of
Tell us that title again.
The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning.
Oh, right, okay.
You know, and I haven't read it because of sort of cognitive dissonance, but I will read it. So I think sort of how-to guides, I think, could be really helpful for people in terms of how to do it. And also, and it was touched on before, the value of advice. When I got divorced a few years ago, my solicitor recommended her financial advisor to me, and that has been so useful. And I sort of feel, yes, I need a range of other advisors for other aspects of planning for later life as well. And then I've been involved recently in some research with older carers and their particular needs. These are, you know, older carers and their particular needs. And one of the issues that came up was particularly from people with looking after adult children. How do they plan, not just for their old age, but for the lives, what's going to happen to those adult children when they're no longer around? And there was a willingness to do it, but one of the difficulties was that involved a lot of other people, particularly in the health and social care system, who perhaps weren't ready to have those conversations about what happens when you die. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, not just with older people, but with the people that advise them. And the very last thing I'll say, and forgive me, I'll have to go in a few minutes to one of my several ways of earning a bit of money, but why is this called A Message to Myself? Is this reference to some aspect of popular culture or your report that I've missed? I'd really like to know. Thank you.
Okay, I can't explain why it's called A Message to Myself, but there are messages to myself up on the board. And Claire, perhaps you can tell us why it's a message to myself.
Yes. Can I respond to that and then other things, or do you want to take more questions?
Just say that, because I've got one more. I'm going to take questions in threes.
Yes,
So
I think it's mainly, for us it was just a bit of a whizzing hashtag, wasn't it, really? But to just think about, you know, that actually we all need to, you know, that we all have to take responsibility a bit and think about our own lives, you know, that the thing that's, you know, what would you tell yourself, you know, as we were discussing, you know, what message would you give to your younger self, or what message would you give to your older self? So it's very much about really trying to, for us all to kind of think this is about everybody, and that we need to think about our own futures.
And I think if you look at those, and we'll take some of them later, they're very much about what I want when I'm older or not so well as I am now. And it's a thing people don't think about, but by making you write it on a sort of big postcard, it brings it to mind. The lady there wants to ask.
Hello, I'm Catherine Seymour from Independent Age, the Old People's Charity. I wanted to mention something really about a particular aspect of planning. And a few months ago, earlier this year, we released a report about the impact on older people of partner bereavement. And as well as looking at the impact, the sort of grief and emotional impacts, we also looked at the impact of health, finances, and practical impacts. And we know, for instance, financial impacts that certainly in heterosexual relationships, when a partner dies, women are worse off, but men are better off financially. But we also looked at practical aspects, which could range from the person, the partner who died could have been the driver in the couple, or could have been the person who arranged for the social events. And in couples, we tend to have complementary skills and complementary abilities. So when one person dies, actually there's a big hole left. We interviewed about 20 people ranging between 65 and 95 who had lost their partner, and many of them said that the biggest impact for them was actually the practical impacts, because they were the most unexpected and they hadn't done planning about this. And so many of them after the event said, I wish I had learnt to drive earlier. I wish I didn't have to learn to cook whilst I was grieving. Or I wish I'd asked where the shed key was. Or I wish I'd known what the password for the laptop was. But when reflecting on the reasons why they didn't plan, there was two things really. One, even though they knew that one would die before the other, no one wanted to imagine that. Nobody wanted to think through the practical day-to-day, what will it be like to live without my partner? But the second thing was that for many people in later life, their partner died after an illness, and sometimes a long illness. And during that illness, they didn't want to focus on themselves. They didn't want to focus on what my life will be like without my partner. They wanted to focus on their dying partner's needs. And they felt that to do anything different would be really quite selfish. After the event, they felt that things could have been different, and planning could have a really important impact on how they felt afterwards and how they experienced that bereavement. And it was an overriding message in our report that for the older people we interviewed, this was something they wanted to pass on to others who might go through this, that planning could be really important in that.
Thank you. This idea of sort of saying let's go out to dinner and discuss death is coming out, I think. People think that, but it's a practical thing, isn't it, that we don't do. You know, sometimes my wife says, oh, you know what, it would be awful, you know, but we don't actually sit down and think, okay, what are the things we can do now to make it better? You just never do that. Either way, it's too awful to think about. Okay, lots and lots of things there. There was Catherine on the impact of bereavement on a couple that was very interesting. 70 the new 50 for the gentleman over there in dementia. Pensions, which I'm sure we talked about, and groups. And this idea from the lady at the front that, you know, groups are one thing, but she actually prefers to go to the library, terribly old-fashioned of you, go to the library and take a book out, or perhaps go on the internet and find a book about things, and I think that's very interesting. So, a number of points. Claire, do you want to answer, just comment on some of them from your research point of view?
Well, yeah, so I just, actually I'm going to comment on the death issue, because, and it's not particularly from my research, but it's something which I've come about through other research. There is actually a death cafe movement, which is really quite interesting, because there is a recognition out there that people don't like talking about death. Now, death cafe sounds horrendous, but Google it, because it's actually quite interesting, and it's the idea that now we're all more secular, people don't talk about it, and that actually, as you were saying, it might be rather a good idea to engage with the subject. I like the sound of your book.
Okay, thanks very much. So, panel, comments. I mean, perhaps we talked to James and Matthew first about this idea of pensions, because this gentleman there raised a very important point that we're not saving enough, but how do you get people to save more? I mean, how do you feel about that? Because auto enrolment, it's too little, isn't it, basically? Sorry, microphone.
I'll come to that in a second, because I just like, yeah, I will, actually will, but I'd like to get to just by trying to address your sort of central point you're making, so, because, you know, would it be better if companies were offering defined benefit pensions for people who work for those companies? Absolutely. I'm in precisely the age group that has completely failed to benefit from defined benefits. I have 6 months of defined benefits myself. It would be really good, but in the current system we have, I think we have to be very careful about knocking the private saving system, because one of the big challenges we have in encouraging people to save in a way that will enable them to have a good lifestyle in retirement is lack of trust in the system. Now, I mean, in Nest, we can't guarantee you a particular return. We're a defined contribution scheme, but we do manage people's money in a way where it's diversified and where we try to iron out the kind of uncertainties that people have. And there are obviously lots of other ideas on the table, like you mentioned CDC, which may well turn out to really help those things. But I think in that context...
Is it possible to explain in one sentence what that is?
Yes,
so I can see a few blank faces.
So collective defined contribution schemes are ones, the Dutch example is quite a good one, where there are a lot of these schemes around, is one where people's money is invested, but there's a certain amount of pooling of the risk that in any given year returns will be poor. Because one of the problems you have in a private pension saving system is if you happen to retire in the year where investment performance has been really bad, or over your life you happen to have been contributing more at a time where you were getting less return on that money, then there's a bit of a something like a postcode lottery, but it's the sort of date of birth lottery. And so collective DC schemes try to iron those age cohort to age cohort differences out, but still rely on the money being invested rather than someone like the employer ultimately underpinning it. And there's a lot of discussion in pensions policy about whether they should come in. James may well have some more to say on that. So I just think I recognise that it would be great if we could all have more guaranteed returns, but I think it's really important to encourage people to be confident that actually, you know, a more generous state pension, or at least one that is more available to groups, particularly like women and carers, that's more reliable, and it increases on a triple lock as an underpin of maybe sort of £7,000 or £8,000 a year in its current value, and then saving on top of that in a way that maybe gives you just £3,000 or £4,000. If you're on £15,000 income, that is actually a pretty good outcome. Now, so coming back to your point there, Paul, I would say actually for a lot of people on lower incomes, a lot of whom are the people who are saving in Nest, it may well be the sort of minimum level of contributions that the government's currently set actually does look like an adequate level of savings. And I think that's particularly true if you consider, again, it's this trade-off between the present and the future. I think the point's been made a few times that if you're in the millennial cohorts, it is quite likely you're on a relatively low income, you have very little access to the housing system, your prospects for seeing income growth are pretty poor, debt levels are quite high. I think we need to be really careful about just trying to push people into saving more and more for the future, if in doing so they're sacrificing their present needs. So I don't think it's as straightforward as saying everyone should be saving more. I think for many people, particularly those on mid-incomes or those like me who've entered the pension saving system later in life, we all need to accelerate our saving a little bit. And I think therefore we need to look at ways of trying to stimulate and encourage more contributions from employers as well as from individuals into the pension saving system, but I don't think it's necessarily true to say that the minimum level should rise for everyone.
Yeah, and James, you made the interesting point, instead of saying, oh, you need £250,000 to buy the state pension, and these are just vast sums of money that no one can really contemplate, or you need to save 20% of your income, you actually think, perhaps looking at lifestyles like the Australians do, because they're actually way ahead of us on this, I think. It's a better way. I mean, is there something we could do in the UK to encourage that?
Yes, well, introduce our idea of retirement income targets in terms of who would actually make that happen. It would be pension schemes themselves, so that's sort of in our members' own gift. But we'd also like to see that idea picked up by key bodies like the new single financial guidance body. We'd like to see it embedded in the pensions dashboard. If that ever happens, and there's a bit of uncertainty about that at the moment, it is a great idea because it would make it easy for people to see what pension savings and entitlements they've got in one view. And if that included a link to targets and planners that help them see all that, that's great.
But that depends on the industry, doesn't it? The government's not going to do this now. The industry.
The government would be the ones to make it happen in the pension dashboard, and to get the single financial guidance body, which is going to be very high profile, to adopt it. So there's a role there for industry and for government. But I can't ignore the point the gentleman in the second row made. I know Matthew's picked it up already. But it is the absolute central point that you rightly made, sir, that if people are not saving enough now, they're not going to get enough out in the future. You know, this is the absolute heart of it all. And you're right, 10 million more people saving because of auto enrollment, great, but they are mostly on very low levels of contributions. And many of them, terrifyingly, don't realise that. They think, I've got a pension, I'm going to be okay. So I do have a slightly different approach from this from Matthew, because I know there's an issue with increasing contributions to people on low incomes, and there's a risk they might end up saving more than they really need to, and I think there are things we can do to address that. But for most people, the basic fact is they need to save more. So I think we do need a plan for getting minimum auto-enrollment contributions, which are currently set to go up to 8%, up beyond that. And we think we should be planning now to get them up at least to 12%. And we've set out a plan in our report. I have a handy copy here. Our Hitting the Target report, you can get it on our website, or have my free copy afterwards if you're first in the queue. And we set out a roadmap for how we would do this. By 2030, you've got to take some time, as has been done with auto-enrollment, to get up to 12%. And as part of that, we do think employers will have to dig a bit deeper, I'm afraid. I mean, that is a tough message to employers, but the money's got to be found. And we think we should be aiming for a 50-50 split between employee contributions and what employers will.
That's very interesting. You say employers, it's difficult for them, because the Bank of England, who has one of the best pension schemes in the country, it puts in, wait for it, 56% of pay into the pension scheme. So all those well-paid people at the Bank of England are going to be very well-paid doing nothing in their retirement. Claire, you wanted to talk about one or two other things.
Director of Evidence.
The scheme's closed now, I'm sorry, it's only for the ones who are already there.
I'd like to broaden it out a bit, and I think the first point this gentleman made here, I think, was really interesting about